That's what I'm want to do.
Like present one
No,
on the screen.
live. Take us live. Go live.
Yeah, go live.
We are live.
We are, okay. Before we get started, just a word about the schedule today. I hope to get as far as Senate File 117, the parental rights in education, which would be the last bill. I'm hoping we'll get a presentation on that from the sponsors and be able to have some time to ask some questions. I suspect, I'm sure we will not be able to take all the testimony. So we'll start with that on Friday, take the testimony then. But committee, that's going to be a complicated bill. We may need to amend it a time or two, so pay attention to that. And for sure, we will carry 117 over to Friday. I hope we'll have time to at least get the initial presentation in. Apologize to everybody. This storm did delay things. And frankly, I was surprised when I came outside. I can't see very well from where I stay in the hotel. I was surprised at how bad it really was and how much it slowed things down. So apologize for the slight delayed start. First bill for our consideration is going to be Senate File 46, Community College Funding Inflation Adjustment. This is a joint interim bill. Let me give just a little background on it, and then I'll ask Community College Commission to present it to us. Frankly, a number of us felt during the interim that our community colleges were not keeping up with inflation in their budgets. And that the system was causing some problems. And this bill is really intended to be a push on that and to try to get the system to function a little better, because we do have a problem there. It may or may not accomplish the purpose, but it's a first attempt at it. With that, Community College Commission, will you come forward and tell us about the bill and how you see it working?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Sandy Caldwell, Executive Director of the Wyoming Community College Commission. And I have with me someone familiar to all of you, and that's Mr. Michael Swank. He is the Chief Financial Officer for the Community College Commission. As for the new members of the committee, we did work throughout the interim with the Joint Education Committee and really built off the work that had started in the Joint Appropriations Committee. So I want to share that a little bit. The Joint Education Committee became the home committee for the community college, for the community colleges, Community College Commission, and it allowed them to take that work and then do a deep dive on what had transpired. What this bill gets to, and I'll walk through those specific sections, is the Community College Commission does not have the legislative authority to ask for an adjustment to our state aid, to the standard budget. It is just an odd dynamic, the way that works. And this bill is to provide the ability for the commission to make that request. And it puts sidebars on it, frankly. It makes it very specific. It is still subject to a legislative appropriation, but it creates the mechanism for that. In the past, we have not been able to ask. We sought guidance on that. I'll share that more about that in just a moment. What I want to do is just walk through the bill first, make sure you see those components, and then provide a little bit more context for that. And then Mr. Swank has some real specific information for you to hopefully answer any questions about what that is, what that means, what the metrics are right now and how we would move forward on that. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on page 1, what the bill does is it authorizes an exception budget request for the community colleges for an external cost adjustment for inflation only. And it's very narrow in what it allows for the commission to do, and it only allows the capacity for us to do that. The remainder of page 1 is unchanged. When you go to page 2 of the bill draft, what is there from lines 1 through 11 until the end of line 11 is existing language. So this is to insert text to allow for us to have the capacity to even put a request in our budget. So on lines 12 through 19, what this section does is provide for us to formally ask that upon action of the commission for an external cost adjustment every biennium. It allows for that every biennium, and to only be for the purposes of inflation. So it is very specific when we could even make the request, and it is specific in that it may only be an ECA for inflation. If we go then to page 3, in the very top of that inserts a new section, subsection G, in that piece of legislation that exists already. And this begins to prescribe what we can even ask for in that inflation. It then moves into sections Romanet 1, Romanet 2, and Romanet 3 that then require us at the Community College Commission to bring this forward to the Joint Education Committee and to the Joint Appropriations Committee so that it is very clear the metrics that we use for fixed and variable cost adjustments. We have to really create what that's going to look like, and so that those committees can consider the components that the commission brought forward. And that has to be prescribed, and we have some best practices that we will use, and this was discussed during the interim committee. Romanet 2 also says that we have to bring forward what that tuition has been in the past and what in potential tuition will be in the future. The Community College Commission, in fact, does have a tuition policy, and that is something that is worked through every 5 years, and the commission does take action on that they review it every year. They take action on it, they're required to take action every other year. They have taken action as well in the interim years as well. The commission has raised tuition, I believe, 8 out of the last 10 years, and we have a much higher percentage on that. We can share more. The next section is page 3, lines 20 through 23, and that then says that there is no automatic, there's no prescribed escalation. It is still subject to legislative appropriation as to whether or not they want to consider that, because that always still lies within the power of the legislature to determine whether or not they want to fund that. And Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this creates an effective date on July 1 of 2023 for the next biennium. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I would be happy to provide more context on this and a little bit of the history particularly for the new members, and then answer any questions. And then I would like for Mr. Swank to provide some content. So if I may I share some background?
Okay. I think what we'll do next is hear from Mr. Swank, and then we'll ask questions of both of you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Michael Swank, the Chief Financial Officer with the Wyoming Community College Commission. The information, we just wanted to provide you some background related to the funding sources for Wyoming Community Colleges. As the Joint Interim Committee received quite a bit of information on all the different ways in which the Commission works with the colleges to allocate and also review financials for the colleges. One note I did want to make on this bill This bill would not impact the state aid requests that we submit to the legislature related to health insurance reimbursement or the retirement reimbursement allocations. So if you look into our budget book, our biennial budget book, we have 4 state aid lines. One is the unrestricted state aid block grant, which is what this bill relates to. There's the health insurance, the retirement reimbursement, and the state or college libraries. Those last 3 are not impacted by this bill. The other, what Dr. Caldwell also noted is that if this bill were to pass, we would have to revise our rules related to our funding allocation model and putting our process for articulating this request within our rules. That would require to go out public comment and review by the colleges as well. In terms of financial background, traditionally, or I guess maybe historically, the state has, in order to balance state interests and local interests, state aid has traditionally been about a 60% portion of colleges' state aid. The other 40% would be divided roughly evenly between tuition and local property tax revenues. In the last 10 years, 10 to 12 years or so, that distribution or proportions have been changing, where state aid has become a lower part of the operational funding for colleges. I believe this last fiscal year, it's around 53 to 55%. It varies a little bit by college, but what this bill is attempting to do is to keep whatever state aid is in the standard budget for colleges to keep up with the impacts of inflation, basically making the purchasing power roughly equivalent over time, not necessarily trying to expand state aid, just keep up with the impacts of inflation. One of the things I think other members of the legislature have been here for a while, we often get questions, what has been the inflation impact since whatever time period? Usually we go back to 2010, which was the last time the community colleges received a specific inflationary adjustment to the state aid line. Since 2010, if you just use the Wyoming Cost of Living Index, inflation has been roughly just over 45%. If you utilize the standard budget in 2010, which was $188 million, the inflationary impact on that would equate to roughly a $270 million state aid budget. Sorry.
A little bit. They're trying to take notes because we're going to have to present this on the floor.
Sorry.
Okay, the inflation since 2010 has been 45%.
Yes, 45.1%.
40, okay, 45.1. Is that Wyoming cost of living or is that CPI?
That's the Wyoming Cost of Living Index for the second quarter. And we usually try to look at something most closely related to Wyoming. There are other options out there like the Higher Education Cost Index and those types of things. But for general speaking, we try to go back to what is most relevant to Wyoming. And what I was, pardon me, Mr. Chairman, if you apply that 45% on the standard budget for 2010, which was $188 million, that would be roughly a $270 million state aid budget today for fiscal year 23-24.
Again, you were a little fast.
Okay. So the state aid budget for the fiscal year 2009-2010 biennium was $188 million. Our current standard budget for fiscal year 20, going into the next biennium would be $163 million. But if you kept up with inflation over that time frame from 2010 to, I believe it's the second quarter of 2022, it's a little over $100 million impact to state aid. And one of the largest reasons for this,
And
sorry,
the
go ahead.
inflation impact is 100 million more than that.
Correct. Rough numbers. We're trying to keep it simple, but I may not be working.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question?
Sure. Go ahead. Representative Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Swank, are you saying that you would be asking us for another $100 million?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, that is not the case. what I was trying to frame is that based on the state aid line from 2010, and the last time the colleges received an inflationary adjustment, inflation has eroded purchasing power of the state aid line by a significant amount. What this particular bill would do would actually only be going back to the most recent biennium and looking at inflation for over a 2-year period.
Thank you. I will have more questions when we get to that point. Thank you.
A couple other items. When you look at the other funding sources for the colleges, local property tax and tuition, as Dr. Caldwell said, the commission is required by statute to implement tuition changes for the college system. No college can do it on their own. Colleges do have independence on how they implement student fees, course fees, administrative fees, that sort of stuff. But when you look at tuition, the colleges have, the commission has increased tuition since 2010 by about 54%, from an in-state rate of, pardon me, I believe it's $68 per credit hour to $105 per credit hour. In terms of actual revenue, budgeted revenue for the colleges, it's increased roughly 44%. So if you look at the actual tuition rate increase versus the revenue increase, there's a little bit of a disconnect. And part of that is due to enrollment.
Okay, slow down, back up just a little bit.
Apologize.
Okay, the tuition in 2010
$68 per credit hour.
per credit hour, and currently is,
$105 per credit hour.
and that's obviously a good deal more than the 45% inflation. What is it in percentage terms?
Mr. Chairman, the tuition rate of per credit hour has increased 54%.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may add for the benefit of the newer members on the committee.
Yes.
For the newer members on the committee, I think it is important to note that the commission did take tuition very seriously, as you can tell, and that has kept pace actually in faster than inflation for the community colleges. And in fact, all of the colleges received a letter from federal student aid that the rate of tuition had increased too much. And we had to respond to that on behalf of all of the colleges. They all had to submit a letter to explain that, and we had to provide the statement from the Community College Commission that the determination of tuition was from the commission. And so that is something that the commission has to also weigh very, very carefully, is how do we make sure we're taking care of ourselves before we come to the state. And we really have maxed on that tuition, as evidenced by the fact that all of the colleges received a letter on the pace in which tuition has been raised.
And the state constitution has a provision that applies, strictly speaking, to the university, saying it should be as nearly free as possible. We have, I think, informally tended to say that really ought to apply to the community colleges, which didn't exist when that constitutional provision was written. And you know, I can see, I've got a granddaughter at Casper, student Casper College, and I can see what's happened to the tuition, and you couldn't describe it as nearly free as possible.
Mr. Chairman, and the legislature did address that. That is in fact in statute to include the community colleges. They were not, of course, in the Constitution. They didn't exist yet. You were 100% correct. But the legislature did take that step. It is prescribed that the Community College Commission is to ensure that it's as nearly as free as possible at the community colleges.
What has happened to the local property tax revenues?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. That was the next step. I appreciate the segue there. One of the things I did want to make in terms of context, or wanted to state in terms of context, beginning around the 1980s, the state wanted to balance state and local interests in the colleges, and that's when state aid truly became a much more larger component of college funding. In the 1980s, there have been periodic appropriations since the 1960s, but the 1980s, I believe, is when they started the current model of sharing, of providing state aid in a consistent fashion began in the 1980s. In terms of property tax, the reason why I brought that up is that property taxes can be incredibly volatile. When we do just a straight comparison of what, say, the 2022 assessed valuation of those counties is, and the 2010 assessed valuation of those counties, it's not necessarily a linear progression. Because at certain times between those two dates, 2016, 17, 21, or 2020 and 2021, property taxes went down significantly in those counties as well. So it's not a linear progression when you compare. However, when you do compare the assessed valuation of 2022 to 2010, on average, statewide, for those 7 counties that have assessed valuation for colleges, it's a change of about 44%. So it's 44% higher today than it was in 2010. One other caveat to that is when you talk about property tax collections, when you look at the fiscal year or the 2022 assessment, the actual collections are delayed, both on mineral slightly, not as much as it used to be because now it's on a monthly basis, but there's a lag time of 3 to 4 months between assessment and collection. And then non-property is usually on an 18-month lag between when it's assessed and when the collection actually is obtained by the county. So that 2022 assessed valuation, though it may be higher, it's going to be collected over a longer period of time. So that's not immediate revenue directly at or directed to the colleges right away. The last thing is I did want to note that in terms of the 7 counties that we look at for the community college districts themselves that assess this property tax, 5 of the 7 counties, their assessed valuation did not keep up with inflation. They were at 40% or lower. 2 counties are higher, but 5 of the 7 are actually lower than the pace of inflation.
And Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Mr. Swank is specifically referencing 7 community college districts. We do have 8 community college districts. Gillette Community College District does not assess the full 4 mills, so they are not included in these calculations, and they are not eligible to receive any state funds.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so if you compare the current ratios, the percentages, state aid's at 54% instead of 60, is that right?
Roughly, it's between 53 and 55%.
What are the ratios, the other 2 rates?
Mr. Chairman, off the top of my head, I think tuition's about 26%. And then local revenues around 20%.
The local revenue is close.
Close, correct. And those do slightly vary year to year based on the volatility of enrollment and property taxes.
Yeah. Okay, committee? Any further questions? Sherry, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have a few questions. First of all, if this inflation adjustment were approved, how would that look in the standard budget, and how would that be presented both to the Education Committee and the Appropriations Committee? We'll start there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, I'll start with that and I'll let Mr. Swank answer that. So we have a prescribed process for how the commission has to adopt the budget so that they can be submitted. So we have our budget guideline, right? Our requirements to submit our agency budget on behalf of the colleges, and that is the end of August. We start that process on early. In April, we do a workshop for the Community College Commission. Should this bill pass, we will start that process right away, although it couldn't be effective until July 1. Our budget is not due until August 31st. They take action the last Friday in August. So what would happen during that meantime is we would be writing the rules to make sure that what is required in here for us to use as the metrics and measures to even make the request would be done in a very transparent process. The first budget hearing for the commission is in June. So in June, we would go through very robustly what that looks like. And we would be sharing that. I anticipate there would at least be one joint education interim committee. I'm not sure that schedule has to be done, but we did that in this last couple of years, actually. And we would be sharing that immediately with certainly the Joint Education Committee, and we could submit that or request to present that to the Joint Appropriations Committee. That helps us refine. The commission then adopts the tentative or draft budget. We make revisions on that draft budget all the way up until they take final action in August. And then we would, throughout the interim session, be providing that information publicly for consideration. So our budget, even our last August one, is all public information. We were to be very transparent on that effort. So we would be following the rules that we'd be writing based on what is required in this statute, and certainly making sure we were using data that is appropriate and best practice, not gathering what would be most beneficial, but what would be accurate in what you see.
Could you, Senator Steinmetz, could you repeat the question and could you answer the question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the question is, in the standard budget, what line, what section, where would this be found in the budget so that we can see it? Because as you know, in K-12 education, the external cost adjustment is outside the model, which is one of my concerns about putting this in your standard budget. The external cost adjustment in K-12 is outside the model. A recommendation has to be made from this committee. Granted, that's partially because we haven't recalibrated, and we all understand as much as we can about that at this particular moment. But why is yours going to be different than what we do for K-12, and why would it be a part of the standard budget? What line item would it be on, and how would it be presented?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, the current unrestricted state aid line is Unit 201 in the budget of the commission. We would provide this each biennium as an exception request within our budget, and it would be up to the legislature to appropriate that funding. We could, if necessary, provide this within a different unit and to have this separated from our state aid line. The overall concern is that it is intended to be an inflationary adjustment on that state aid standard budget. So that's the original plan. The original idea was to bring it into that standard budget.
Follow up?
Okay, yeah, yes, follow up, and I'm going to ask a follow-up question too right now. So your original plan was just put it in your standard budget, and this doesn't do that, right? It makes an exception request.
No.
Mr. Chairman, the intent of this bill, as I understand it, is that we would be authorized to request each biennium through an exception, an inflationary adjustment. If it were to be funded based on the practices of the state budget department, it traditionally goes into the standard budget as an ongoing request. However,
It would be.
if the legislature so chooses, we can separate it out into a different unit and to call it out separately in terms of the information in our budget request.
Okay, that answers that question. So it would, as of right now, you're contemplating though putting it just in the unrestricted area. So as we see the budget come through, we see each line and we see each exception request. So you would have this be on a separate page and say, this is our exception request for the external cost adjustment, but then it would go in on the line item under unrestricted. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, that is the current understanding. What I did want to note is if you look on page, pardon me, what I believe Dr. Caldwell was referencing is on page 3, the Romanet I, that requires all the information that we utilize in terms of making this calculation, the indices we use, go to both joint appropriations, joint education. What I believe Dr. Caldwell was referencing is that throughout that process, whatever information we use to make that exception request, the background information and the calculations we make will also go to joint education and joint appropriations to provide the context for that request.
Okay. Follow? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess I'm just wondering how, being new to this committee, so please bear with me, how you came to this process rather than putting it in under some of the other areas under 21-18-205. So for example, when you go into that statute, every request that you make is very specific, and it's specific that the legislature has to see it, consider it separately. It can only be expended for that purpose. And so, for example, in that section 21-18-205 under E Romanet 2, the special purpose funding may be requested under this subsection for use by the commission in funding new programs addressing unanticipated and emerging statewide needs during the biennial budget. So that's specific to new programs, but why would we not, what was the rationale, I guess, as to not doing kind of a subsection like that, or even expanding these new programs and putting it in that area?
Let me answer that one in part, because I'm one of the guilty parties here. I don't understand the internals of the mechanics of the budgeting process. We did not want to do try to do an automatic increase, such as you see with our separate system like the K-12 external cost adjustment. We wanted to put it part of the regular budget process, and I thought, gee, that makes it make it an exception budget request, and then the committee the Appropriations Committee could see that separately, and the legislature could see it separately and decide to grant it or not. But then I figured out should be part of the ongoing standard budget going through, that the standard budget for community colleges does not keep them up with inflation. So that seemed to be, to me, the most appropriate place. And frankly, you're several steps further in the weeds than the committee got in the interim.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I can also provide a little extra for Senator Steinmetz and new members of the committee. Senator Steinmetz, this also, we actually are prohibited right now from making a request like that. This is part of the work that we undertook at the direction of the Joint Appropriations Committee to really look at sustainable funding and what were some of the challenges or barriers. This particular item came up because we did not think that we had a mechanism to make this request. So what we did do as a part of that process is we did seek Attorney General opinion on how can we make an exception request for this specific thing. The statute that you referenced are the ones that were studied. That's the area that was specifically studied by the Attorney General. And we do have the opinion that the commission cannot make a request other than a specific programmatic, like WIN or that kind of thing. We are prohibited from making any kind of request adjustment to the state aid. In our last biennium budget, we in fact did have a fixed cost request based on inflation. The commission could not take action on that. They had to ask the governor. The governor was gracious in the state budget department to allow us to list it and include the information, but we could not make that request. And as it stands now, that we are barred from doing exactly what you just asked in terms of requesting an ECA, inflation, anything like that for the purposes of the standard budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might have some more later, but I'll let someone else.
Does anybody else want to testify on this? Aaron Taylor.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Erin Taylor, and I am the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of Community College Trustees. And what I thought I would do, I've spoken to some of you about this bill to provide a little bit of background and just to kind of fill in a little bit of the gaps. I think the commission did a really nice job of explaining why we're here with this bill. But in terms of the more global sense of how the community colleges have been communicating the needs of the colleges in the last probably 4 years or so, I'd say this is a really important element of us trying to really tell the legislature what the needs of the colleges are. And I'll just give a little bit of a background, you know, depending on who's in what position or the administration or the environment where we're really cutting and we're before the Appropriations Committee and Senator Steinmetz with her good experience on that committee has seen the conversations where we're trying to express the true needs of the colleges, but yet we have some limitations on how we can do that through the budget process. And so probably for the last 4 years, my association, WACD, has been working, you know, with the commission and how they present the budget. Our end has been communicating. These are the true needs of the colleges, and maybe they can't come through in the budget process. We do have a recalibration every 4 years due to declining enrollments. Those have come forward with actually declines in what that recalibration process might have to look like. The governor and the legislature has been very generous in suggesting that the colleges haven't had to take those cuts. But it was, I think, last year in the budget, was it last year, that the commission did say these inflationary factors are true costs to the colleges. And that took us down to the path of getting that AG opinion that said, actually, you can't do this in your statutes. It was kind of a surprise to members on the joint committee in the interim to hear that, because we hear about that through K-12 all of the time, but that the colleges don't even have a pathway to have the conversation, I think was a surprise to a lot of people. And so I just wanted to explain that a little bit. Nothing's automatic, but the fact that it would come to both this committee and the Appropriations Committee seemed to satisfy members of the interim committee that was appropriate. And you heard from Dr. Caldwell how they would present all of the factors that go into that, rather than hiring an outside consultant and all the things that we do for K-12. So that was discussed. I think it was discussed pretty robustly, but I know there are members here on the committee that could probably comment to that as well. So, Mr. Chairman, WACD definitely supports this. If what I can do to help you, if this moves forward, is put this information together, all of the things that you heard factually, numerically from Mr. Swank, I can put that together in a one-pager for you. That would I think, help you out with the floor discussion. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, we'll close public testimony. And I'm sure you have some further questions.
I do just have one further
Okay,
question.
go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and maybe know the answer. So they were able to submit and ask for an inflation adjustment through the governor's office. But that was just a courtesy, or how did that happen? I'd like to hear a little more about that if you could.
Caldwell?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, yes, that was a courtesy that they did allow that, and we made sure to share that during joint appropriations, that the governor's office and the state budget, the governor's office was gracious enough to allow us to present that, and the state budget department helped us work with how to put that within our budget. And then the Attorney General's office carefully worked with us to make sure that motion language when the commission adopted their budget reflected as such.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So how was that? I can't recall right offhand. I probably went over that budget request. But is that a part of your standard budget going forward? Is that embedded now, or is that ongoing, or was that a one-time request?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, that was in fact included in our request. That specific request was not funded. However, appropriations did provide us 7.5 million. Michael, am I saying the right thing? $7.5 million in additional funding that would be included in the standard.
And follow up, Mr. Chairman. So what would your inflationary adjustment calculation had been, if you could remind me of the number, what we gave you, and then what your request was?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Steinmetz, while Michael is looking that up, I'm going to go right off the top of my head and see if I can get this correctly. The calculation that we used was actual. We didn't use inflation. We used actual numbers from the colleges, and we only did that on a portion of the fixed cost. We calculated things like the electricity, insurance, those utilities, that kind of thing, to make it very, very clear what we brought forward, which I think is why we were granted to do that. And I believe Michael has that number.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, the request that was provided in last year's biennial budget was $21.2 million. That was denied by the governor as well as JAC. On the floor, the legislature put in $7.5 million that was not designated as any sort of inflationary adjustment. It was just an addition to state aid. If you recall, during the budget reductions in 2021, there was a one-time $8 million appropriation made to the college state aid line. That was removed in the standard budget, and I don't know the reasoning, but it basically is a wash between what was removed in that standard budget of $8 million and the 7.5 added for ongoing.
All right, thank you very much. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
And Michael, that was 21 point, how many million?
Mr. Chairman, 21.2.
2. And that was denied by the JAC, and then did the 7.5 wind up in the standard budget going forward?
Mr. Chairman, the motion of the legislature was to put that in the state aid line. There was no other language that made it one time. So based on the standard budget procedures of the state budget department, it is likely into the standard budget for the 25-26 biennium.
Okay. Okay. Seeing no other public testimony, committee, ready for a motion on the bill?
Move the bill.
Motion is due pass. Discussion. Mr. Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I appreciate the good work of the committee on this, and I support our community colleges, and I recognize the funding situation we find ourselves in, and it's a complex problem. We all know we're grappling with it. I also see that the body is very receptive to community colleges, and we seem to be receptive to additional funding to them on the floor quite a bit. Having been on appropriations, we many times would say, we know the body is going to put money in for community colleges on the floor, and we'd try to take that into our deliberations. And so I'm going to have to, I'm very hesitant for this to be in the standard budget, and I appreciate your reasons as to why you put it there. If it were in the area where it was special funding and they could request it when they needed it, but they are tied to the mill levies, and so when property taxes go up, they do see an increase in their funding source, which I realize it's only 26 or 20% of their revenue. But we've been very concerned and very watchful of adding things into the standard budget, and while it's not an automatic escalator, it could easily become one. And so just because of my appropriation days, I'm going to have to be a no on this bill, and I understand if the rest of the committee's not, but I just can't support it at this time. I might be convinced on the floor if you pass it out, but I'll keep listening, but I'll be a no.
Point of view is that I didn't want an automatic escalator. I wanted to have the inflation figures before us where they were available and be available to the members generally on request. And the best way to do that, I could figure, was to have it as a regular exception budget request. And then we could see it and use our judgment. The current situation, I'm afraid, is that we are looking at what's going on in my college. The quality of the instruction, I think, is going down. They're having to gradually not replace some of their senior faculty as they retire, and use adjunct professors, instructors, who really are on average, I think, not quite as high quality. And we're seeing the quality of our institution being eroded. And I do try to pay attention to that. It's so important to the community. And I think that what this bill provides is a mechanism where we can find out what really inflation is doing to those colleges, and avoid some of the current circumstances where I think the colleges are hurting on a selective basis. So for those reasons, I'm going to favor the bill. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I share your thoughts on the fact that this is not actually a budget increase. This is developing a process so that there can be a thorough contemplation of changes in revenue, changes in budget need, looking at inflationary factors. And that process has previously been lacking. So it does tend to be effectively an ad hoc budgeting process where when we get together as a legislature, there was no formal real request that was developed out and vetted. So it's almost like we think we might need this much money, and then it comes to the floor and some amount of money that we don't really know where it came from ends up either passing or not passing. Having a process like this is really good for the budget and for us to understand and have some lead time on it ahead of session as we're developing it, instead of waiting until we get to session when we know we don't really have enough time to think everything through and vet all the details. So honestly, to me, as we entered this process, it was kind of surprising that this wasn't already in place. And it's my understanding that it was effectively an attorney general interpretation that led to a prohibition against the College Commission providing a budget recommendation. I don't quite know all of the details and nuances of how that took place, but it doesn't seem like there was an active effort to shut down a budget process by the legislature, and we're the entity that is supposed to be responsible for making those decisions. This looks like a responsible process. Comes through Education Committee as it should, goes to Appropriations as it should. There's no guaranteed escalators built into it. I think that's just exactly what we're looking for, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion? Sensing we're ready to vote, call the roll, please.
Senator Brightman? Senator Brennan? Senator Rothfuss? Senator Steinmetz? No. Chairman Scott? 2 ayes, 3 noes.
Is yeah, thank you. Senate File 98, Education Certificate of Completion. Senator Brallo, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate this opportunity. I will try to get this done in less than an hour. This bill is, I think, very straightforward, and I'd first like to point out it came from requests that grew out of one of the fall State School Board Association meetings. Came to me through the chairman of my Campbell County School District's board, and also through one of the school districts in Converse County from their board chairman, saying we would like to approach a way to not count folks who do not graduate because of their students with disabilities and their cannot meet the graduation as dropouts. Well, that is federal law concerns. But we also, as we discussed this, and I started to learn more about it and interacting with our very good LSO staff, including Ms. Hytrek, we also recognize that some districts are recognizing students with disabilities who complete their work or their IEPs, and other districts are not. So the approach was to take let's have a standardization across the state, so all districts through the State Board of Education, so all districts kind of are on the same page, and there is a process to recognize both the students, the families, and the educators who have been through this process with these students over the years. And then that gives us some context when we look at graduation rates and dropout rates, that there's something that isn't being factored into that, and that's students who would not otherwise graduate, but they have completed a course of work in our public system, in our public school system. And so that's what this bill does. And it's a very just simple bill, direct bill, to recognize there is work being done and to put some context over our graduation versus dropout rates. It's not something we can report to the feds. They won't recognize it, but we can understand it to better, and we certainly want to recognize those students. And that's probably the most important thing. So the bill is very straightforward, Mr. Chairman. Page 1, State Board of Education, and this is almost identical language to what we do with graduation requirements. During a high school diploma, we take some language out of other places in statute, talk about establishing requirements for students with disabilities under the IDEA to obtain a high school certificate of completion. That's where we are. And then the second part of the bill on page 3 is that these boards of trustees of each school district shall basically report to the Department of Education that they're in compliance, that they're following these guidelines. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the genesis of the bill. That's the substance of the bill. I'd be glad to stand for any questions. And as and I'll just add one, I guess, more personal comment, as my wife is an educator and holds an advanced degree in special education. And we spent a lot of time in the community supporting a variety of organizations that that support students that have some of these challenges. It's very dear to our heart personally. I do think it is more than worthwhile to recognize the efforts of these students and the commitment that we as a state make to them. And I know you just had a discussion about funding and community colleges. Well, we're also, trying to advance these young people's lives, give them the best quality of lives and educational opportunities. So I think this is a community effort to understand what is happening and to acknowledge these achievements. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to stand for any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, any questions?
To be the one that talks.
Go ahead. Go ahead. This committee, we welcome participation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Barlow, I just had one question. I know that our fiscal note doesn't relate to our local entities, so do you anticipate any cost to the school district to generate these certificates or comply with this law?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I think this would be all part of due course. And I don't know if there's a specific line item in a school district's budget for diplomas. But I would say this would fit under that as far as just acknowledging, that. So I don't believe there's any fiscal cost, excessive fiscal cost the incidental of actually providing a certificate of some sort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else here want to testify on this bill? Mr. Farmer.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Farmer, Wyoming School Boards Association, thank you for the opportunity to speak. This concern did come from our membership. As a matter of fact, it was Sheridan County School District number 1 that first brought this forward. Really just the idea of, hey, our special ed teachers, our special ed students, they work really hard. They put in a lot of effort, a lot of work to get through the things that they do for their individual education program. And at the end of the day, they're counted as a dropout. And that's terribly demoralizing. It's very difficult to tell them, you don't count the same way. You passed your IEP, you did what you needed to do, but you don't count as a graduate. And we said we would love to change that law. And unfortunately, that is a part of the federal law, the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. However, Mr. Chairman, there is a way under ESSA that we could do this in the state. And I'm going to ask right now that you consider this for an interim topic. The state could go about creating an alternate diploma. An alternate diploma is an allowable mechanism under ESSA that would allow them to count in the extended cohort graduation rate. So it does allow for them to count not as the 4-year on-time graduates, but in the extended graduation rate. Wyoming has taken some steps down that road toward alternate diplomas, but Mr. Chairman, it does require a fair amount of work. And I think we need to get our arms around exactly what it would take in order for us to have this alternate diploma so that we could count these kids as graduates. So this is something that we've heard, as the bill's sponsor said, we've heard strong support across our membership. Campbell County has been very supportive. Fremont County has been very supportive. Converse County has been very supportive. Quite a number of folks have come forward and said, hey, we're willing to do whatever we can to support this because it's important. This is a component of our student population that we would really like to recognize. So this bill is an excellent first step. This bill has de minimis cost to districts, and it allows us to recognize the completion of an educational program identified by the students' multidisciplinary team, and a way to say that they have made strides, they have completed expectations. Unfortunately, they still count as a dropout for the federal law, but this is a first step. And if we get to it in the interim, we can look at how we get closer to recognizing these students. So, Mr. Chairman, we strongly support the bill and ask for your favorable consideration.
Any questions? Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else Anybody else?
Mr. Chairman, Janine Bay-Teske from Teton County. We do this, and I will just tell you at graduation, this is where the most excitement comes in, is when those students walk across the stage and receive their certificate. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, committee, do I hear a motion? Motion is due pass. Any discussion? Discussion. I will say, quite frankly, I'm quite supportive of this. It makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure we want to go the further step of calling it a diploma. I think maybe we could figure a way to not count them as dropouts either, because they really aren't. And frankly, I think it's none of the federal's business what we count as a diploma and what we don't. But I think this one is quite appropriate because it reflects what is really going on. They are completing the work according to their best abilities in the IEP. And the IEPs, I think, are pretty good that way. So I think this one is entirely appropriate. Okay, any further discussion? Call the roll, please.
Senator Beitman. Senator Brennan.
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss. Senator Steinmetz.
Aye.
Chairman Scott.
Aye.
5 ayes.
Okay. Thank you.
Briefly on that, the alternative diploma would not be in place of this. The alternative diploma relating to ESSA. ESSA wants a 4-year graduation and really doesn't care if you graduate much after that. The state of Wyoming traditionally has cared if you graduate after that in 5 or 6 years. So the development of that alternative diploma would still require graduation. We would have a path, which would be a path that would still have the same requirements as a graduation. So just want to make sure that it's not confused with this or a different name for this under ESSA. It's just trying to make sure that we actually are looking for recognition of the importance of, even if you didn't get done in 4 years, it's good if you do it in 5, good if you do it in 6, and we want to recognize that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The next bill for our consideration, Senate File 114, Constitutional Instruction and Examination Requirements. Senator Larson, you're on.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I bring you Senate File 114. It's a rather simple bill. It just adds to what we currently do in our school system a little bit. And so I'll go ahead and go through the bill. Its title is the Constitutional Instruction and Examination Requirements. What it does on page 2, it inserts on line 3 that we will give instruction essentials on the United States Constitution, but I've inserted also that the Bill of Rights will be included and amendments to the United States Constitution. I think these are very, very important parts of our Constitution that our students need to know, and so I wanted to highlight those. Down further in the middle of the page, it states that if a student in Wyoming is going to graduate starting after 2023, 24 school year, they must pass the civics test that is required to become a United States citizen by the United States Citizenships and Immigration Services, with a score of 60%, which our immigrants need to pass when they become citizens. I do want to mention that looking through some of the stuff on the internet, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services posted that some ask what if the immigration test is hard. And they, in 2021, 96% of the immigrants that took the test, 96% of them passed. 90% passed initially, and then 6 took a re-exam. I do also want to say I might want some amendments put in on page 2, line 14, after test, after civics test. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Also, after I would like to put in written, civics, and then after test, consisting of 100 questions. So the line would read district without also passing the written civics test consisting of 100 questions. And the reason for that is the immigrants, during their test, they take, there's 3 parts of the test. They take a written test, a reading test, and then a speaking English test. Well, we don't want to include any of that. But during the test, they only ask them 10 questions out of the 100. So I don't want that, and they only have to answer 6 of them. So I'd like them to actually go through the 100 of them and go ahead and ask or answer them.
So let me see if I just understand what you're asking. If we say it's a written test, that means we get rid of the verbal spoken English and don't require that sort of thing. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. I don't want that. I
Yeah,
think they ought to take the written test. And I could actually go through a couple of the questions that they have if you want at some point. Also, another part of the bill is that they would be required to have some, let's just go ahead and read through it. The constitutional and other instruction required in this section shall be given each academic year in kindergarten through 12 and for 1 year in any higher education degree. So that'd be high school and college, somewhere in there. Currently, they are required to only have 3 years out of the first 9. So they discuss it 1/3 of the time. And then in high school, they do just 1 out of 4. I know there may be a little kickback from this, but it's not that they have to study it intensively. You know, they can take a basic thing like maybe in the kindergarten and go ahead and explain what the flag is or something like that, you know, and have them, you know, just, you know, talk about our flag and why it has the stripes and the stars and such. That's pretty much the bill. I could talk about it some more if you want, but let's go ahead and see if you have questions, I guess, Mr. Chairman.
Any question? Seeing Senator Brightman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Larson. As we talked about briefly when we were discussing this bill before you numbered it, my question was regarding shall we include instruction of the Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers? Because I believe, I told you this, that's key to really understanding what went into making this Constitution, what it's all about, and learning about the Constitution. I think it's critical to read those and really have a grasp of what the debate was all about. Could you explain as to why that's not in there? Or, you know, obviously nothing precludes a school district from, or a civics teacher from bringing it up in his class, but why not on the list?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I had already got the formal version of the bill, and I didn't want to go back and change it and get more co-sponsors to agree to that. But I think that'd be a great amendment. I think those are critical topics that we should have the students see. There was quite a discussion after they proposed the Constitution. And there was for quite a few years back and forth in the papers on why we should do this and why we should not do it. But I think that'd be a great amendment.
Senator Office?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple of questions. So the first is looking at lines 3 and 4, the addition of the Bill of Rights and amendments to the United States Constitution. So the Bill of Rights is obviously the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which are then part of the Constitution. I'm curious, have you heard concerns that the language was being taught and implemented in a way that did not incorporate teaching of the Bill of Rights or the other amendments to the Constitution? And it would seem to me an expectation that as they are part of the Constitution, that the essentials of the United States Constitution would incorporate that.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you that those are part of the Constitution, but I think it's critical that we emphasize those. And that's why I put them in there. I really do think that they are an essential part. Without the Bill of Rights, I do not know if the Constitution would have been passed amongst the states.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, I guess my question is, have you heard of any circumstances where these were not a part of the standards that were being used to implement teaching of this? Because again, standards will have been promulgated and have been promulgated to provide teaching of this. Have you looked through the standards to see what's actually being taught to?
Mr. Chairman, I have not heard of that from parents or students or teachers. Okay. That has not been taught.
And Mr. Chairman, then next question. As we look to both that and the citizens civics test, I guess specifically on the civics test, standards are typically promulgated by the State Department of Education at each grade level. Those standards are then what the teachers use to develop curriculum around to teach to. And that's typically the process. My question then is alignment of the standards with the civics test. Do you know if the civics test is in any way aligned to the standards promulgated by the State Board of Education?
Mr. Chairman, I have not specifically looked into that. I did have comments from a superintendent in my district, and he had spoken to his government teacher or civics teacher, and they felt that this would be no big deal. They said that they thought the students could probably already pass such tests.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess there's my question. Have you taken the test?
I did.
How'd you do?
I got up in there above 60% for
Yeah,
sure.
but did you get into the 80s?
You're invading the student's privacy.
I don't know. Is that a FERPA violation if I'm asking a legislator if they passed the test? I do not know that.
Yeah, maybe.
Mr. Chairman, I've looked this test over because this legislation's come up a few times. And I guess the concern I have is I don't hear a lot of parents, teachers, or education community folks saying the problem is we don't have enough testing, right? That's not a message that's coming through to me at this point in time. In fact, I tend to hear, could you cut down the testing? Adding another test would seem to be a pretty high threshold or a high bar where it would have to clearly provide educational purpose that then enhances the education of the students in the state and leads to better educational outcomes. So I guess my question is, based on the previous testimony where we're not sure if this is aligned to standards, we don't know if it's already being taught, we haven't looked into where in the standards these are being taught, why are our students better off taking an additional test?
Mr. Chairman, I believe they probably are already taking a test similar to this, and I would say that they could probably pass it. I mean, speaking to the superintendent in one of my districts, like I stated before, they weren't concerned. And I think it follows our I don't know how to, I'm missing my words right now, our standards right now, I would guess, other than they might not be picking it every year in a class. I mean, and it's not like they got to teach the whole thing every year.
Right. Mr. Chairman, and one more question with regard to that. The analysis there is that they're probably already doing it and that it's not a problem. But we really haven't dug into whether it's consistent with the standards. And again, some of the questions are like, which state has the Statue of Liberty? And I'm just trying to think of why we very specifically need to train our students to take this test when we're already developing standards around the Constitution, around civics, and those will be reopened, I think, in the next year, actually, to make sure that we have the right material going into those standards. So there'll be a real robust discussion through the State Board of Education. I guess my question is then, with the process in place, why not just work through the State Board of Education process as the civic standards are being opened to ensure that there's adequate emphasis for constitutional amendments? I agree, Federalist Papers, Anti-Federalist Papers, boy, if those aren't in our standards, they sure should be, but I know they are. Why not work through the process that is the way that we typically develop so that the legislature is not getting into specificity of which tests should be taken and which tests shouldn't be taken?
Mr. Chairman, I think this fits perfectly into that then. Why not legislate this? Because this is what I would like to have done. And I think I hear that from many of my citizens in my district, that this is very, very important. We need to make sure that our younger population knows the Constitution, how the country was formed, and all of that. I think we're getting away from that. And I don't, I think this could come up perfectly for the next when they talk about it.
So one more question, Mr. Chairman. From that perspective, where you say that you're hearing from your community support for it, individual school districts have authority over what the graduation requirements are, so long as it's over and above the requirements of the state. I guess my question is, if your district does support this, why wouldn't it be sufficient for your district to add this to your local graduation requirements and respect local control? Why should we do this as a top-down statewide thou shalt adding to the green books?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I think it's our job as legislators to tell our local government, in certain situations, what we expect of them. And they did not form the state. The state formed the cities and the towns and that. So I think it's our duty.
Thank you.
I've got a follow-up question. Series you just answered. We have set the standard that the schools are going to instruct in the essentials of the United States Constitution, the Constitution of the State of Wyoming. How well does this citizenship test that you're proposing that we use here, how well does that align with the standard we have set here on the study of the United States Constitution?
Mr. Chairman, I haven't delved into that deep, and I guess I probably should have, looking at the standards, but I'm guessing it fits well within that.
Follow up on that. If this bill does move forward, Mr. Chairman, could we get an analysis of the alignment between our standards and the citizenship test, a copy of the citizenship test? And if this passes out of committee, bring that to the floor so that we can see very specifically how the alignment takes place and in which grade standards are available that address the citizenship test. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'll work on that.
Okay. Committee? Other questions for the sponsor? Scott? Okay. Thank you very much. Stand by. If we get to working amendments, we may have further questions. Who's next? I see the Farm Bureau here.
Mr. Chairman, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. Not often that I get to appear in front of this committee. This is an issue that's important enough to my members. We do have policy on it, and as hopefully you already know, that's what defines a position I take on an issue, is if we have policy and what that policy is. This is an important topic, an important issue to my Farm Bureau members. We support this bill. Getting more training on the U.S. Constitution is important. We support it. We would also support adding in the Wyoming Constitution. I think back when I started my job, not really quite understanding how the legislative process worked. In 17, maybe after 15 years, I still don't quite understand. But I think that it's important to get the U.S. Constitution, more training, more age-appropriate training throughout their educational career. So sitting in support of this bill, Mr. Chairman, I'd sit for any questions.
Understandments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to let you know that the Wyoming Constitution is already included.
Oh, boy, it got a little warm in here all of a sudden.
Well, I interpreted, you thought the test ought to include the Wyoming Constitution, and the federal test obviously doesn't.
No, sir, that was not my intent.
Okay.
But again, I think getting this training throughout their educational career, be it K through 12, upper education, I think is important.
Okay. Under office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And one of the themes that we've discussed over the year that was typically a priority of Farm Bureau has been local control and trying to make sure that the state wasn't pushing down one-size-fits-all solutions on communities. To the extent that the standards are already there for all of these things, but the key in how to implement it is currently left up to our local school districts. Why is the Farm Bureau deciding that in this instance, a one-size-fits-all solution is appropriate where all districts have to administer the same test, whether they think this is the appropriate test or not, whereas they might prefer a test that's aligned with standards?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, the strongest point for my membership is the training, education on the Constitution, not really having policy on the standardized tests throughout the district. I agree with you. We do like local control. Having a standardized test that's used at the national level, not as strong on that, but we would support that. And that we need some type of continuity across all the districts.
All right, so I am hearing the Farm Bureau say they want more testing in school. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman,
Just one more.
just one more, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, you raise actually a very good point. Again, as I said, the strongest point for my members on this bill is the training on the Constitution. By supporting the bill, I am supporting additional testing. That's not the most important of this bill to me, if that helps answer your question, sir.
Seeing no further questions, thank you very
Thank
much.
you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Tate Mullen. I'm the Government Relations Director for the Wyoming Education Association. We're here to speak in opposition to this bill today. This bill seems to circumvent or supplant the standard-setting process that we have in place, a standard-setting process that has worked very well for our students in the state of Wyoming. The State Board of Education takes a considerable amount of time and energy to develop these standards, and as Senator Rothfuss noted, they will be taking this up here in the near future, our social studies and civic standards. So that standard-setting process utilizes wide stakeholder engagement, including parents, educators, citizens, and we don't feel that the legislature should circumvent a process that has worked incredibly well for our students, districts, and educators across the state. How do we know that that process has worked? Well, one of the ways that we can determine is through our NAEP scores. The most recent NAEP scores, Wyoming is first in 4th and 8th grade math, second in 4th grade reading, Fifth, in 8th grade reading, our Hispanic special education and Title I students have outperformed their national peers in 4th and 8th grade math, as well as 4th grade reading. So these standard setting processes work, they're inclusive, they benefit our students, they benefit our educators, and currently as we have them, our standards do go over the Constitution, they do go over the Declaration of Independence, and this does seem a bit of an a la carte approach, right? To Senator Beitman's point, there are other documents in there that we could be looking at, the Federalist Papers. We need to use the process that we have to set those standards. The other point that I want to raise, during the interim, this committee looked very hard and did a lot of good work looking at teacher retention and attraction. And one of the most contentious areas, one of the areas that led to teacher dissatisfaction was the amount of testing. They have asked time and time again, we need to do something about testing, and that's not include any more testing, it's a reduction in that. So including another test is counter to everything that we heard, this committee heard over the interim about what we need to do, at least a component of addressing that teacher retention and attraction issue. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Questions? Committee? Let me ask one. Those NAEP scores, the NAEP test that you were talking about, they're at a less than high school graduation level. What do they have to do with the subject matter of this bill?
Chairman Scott, it's a good question. So in terms of what those standards do, they develop in every content area, whether that's reading, whether that's math. They look at all those content areas and they look to develop those standards that provide students with a high quality education that make them competitive in the job market of today and tomorrow. That does include the standard setting process for social studies, talking about the process. That process has worked in those scores for math and reading. We don't have the scores for social studies. Can we always improve on those? Absolutely, we can. But the process to do that and achieve that is through the State Board of Education process, not through legislation.
Okay, seeing no other questions, thank you very much. Anybody else? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, Chairman. My name is Wanda Maloney. I am the Chief Policy Officer at the Wyoming Department of Education. I would like to just bring to your attention as we look at this bill and we consider the instruction that would be needed in the state and federal constitution in grades K through 12, that we would want to develop further standards at each grade level. And in order to do that, we feel that we would need additional time to provide the standard development. And in addition to that, we would look at extending that to July 1 of 2024 if we were to develop those for each grade level. We would also, as our standard practice is, that we give districts the opportunity for 3 years to give them the opportunity to put professional development in place, to find resources, and then also to provide any type of training or assessment that they might need to further do this work. We also do believe the civics test could be implemented within the effective date of July 1, 2023. And Mr. Chairman, in reference to the questions that Senator Rothfuss asked, we have done a crosswalk to look at the civics test and align those to the current standards that are in place. And we do have copies of that available. We also have the social studies standards available for you too, that we could provide.
Okay. So you said you've done a comparison of this test that's being called for here with the instruction on the Constitution. Does it align?
I will ask my standards and assessment director to come up and to speak to that. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Lori Hernandez, Director of Standards and Assessment. And as the Chief Policy Officer had stated, we do have two versions of the alignment for you. One shows the question and then the alignment to the state standards. And then the other does a reverse crosswalk showing the standards and then the number of the assessment item that matches. So we do have those copies that we can give you along with the social studies standards, because I did hear that question as well about the Constitution, which is found in standard grade 8, 1-5. And it says specifically on that one, to Senator Rothfuss's question earlier, describe the structures of the United States and Wyoming Constitution, for example, articles, Bill of Rights, and amendments. This version that you're being handed right now is the 128 question version. There still is publicly online two versions, the 100 question item and the 128. So we went ahead and gave you the full one in case you wanted to see those additional pieces as well. You'll see toward the back pages, the ones that are more aligned to the K through 2 grade band are those that refer to what was also mentioned earlier with why are there 13 stripes on the flag? What do the 50 stars stand for, et cetera. And then you see it progress across the grade bands through, all the way K through 12.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick clarification. You mentioned the Constitution was in grade 8, standard 1.5 or whatever. Is that the only grade that it is currently mandated to be taught, or are they getting this every year throughout their education at a more in-depth rate until they graduate, or is this, they only get it in 8th grade and then that's it? Okay, just a little clarification on that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Beitman, while you were talking earlier, I just did a quick Control F search through the document and found that one specifically. But these standards and all of our standards are built in learning progressions so that they build across time. So for example, across that, this is at the bottom of page 10 of the standards document. In grade 5, they'll understand the purposes of the 3 branches of government. And then they'll also understand the purpose of the US legal system and tribal governments. They'll build across as they start to expand and go more global in their understanding of the systems.
Okay, you're giving us some homework to do here. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hernandez, can you describe the timeline and the process that we'll be going through as a state with the State Board of Education and the department and stakeholders to redevelop our civics and social studies standards over the next couple of years?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, we are scheduled in this year to get started, in this calendar year to get started with social studies and to finalize it by 2024 year. And that takes usually about 12 to 18 months from the beginning to the end. And so right now there's probably a projected start date around the summer of this year.
And Mr. Chairman, again, I don't know that all the new members of the committee understand how that process works, and I think it's valuable as we're contemplating putting in statute requirements versus the traditional process. I think it's important to understand how things are done with the traditional process. If you could walk us through that, that would be appreciated.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. The process includes 4 phases, which also includes 3 input periods. There's public input prior to the standards committee starting their work, so that we can understand what the public wants in the standards and what they feel is important about social studies education. Then the committee convenes and creates the standards document, and then that goes out as a draft version for informal public input. And that input is taken to the State Board of Education for consideration as they decide whether to move forward with the proposed standards. If they do decide to go forward, then it goes through the rules promulgation process, which includes another input period as chapter rules are being created. And those comments are also seen not only by the state board, but also by the governor. So those have to go through both the state board and the governor's approval.
We're starting to run out of time. Let me ask how many others you want to testify? Marion? Okay. We're going to carry this bill over to next time just because of time. Are you able, is it inconvenient for you to come back on Friday?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Maloney, you mentioned the recommendation to implement this in July of 2024 for the, for,
Excuse me, and we're not going to get to your bill today.
and then you said you could also get the testing done within the 2023 timeline. For an amendment purposes, would it be cleaner for us to just extend it out to 2024, or should we bifurcate that into two different effective dates?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Beitman, I would agree with that. It would be cleaner to do that, to provide that additional time.
Those are, and there may be at least one other, there's a constitutional amendment that may come to us. So we will have some heavy bills next week, but we can carry this, we're in good shape, we can carry this over to Friday, and that's what I intend to do. So, thank you. I thought we would get through this bill today, but we got hung up on the earlier one that took a lot longer than I thought, so. Okay. Committee.
I don't disagree with, I just